Why do some men seem to carry a force that others don't? You've seen them. They walk into rooms and attention shifts, they speak and people listen. They don't chase validation, yet respect finds them. There's something about their presence, their energy, their gravity that sets them apart from ordinary men. What if I told you the secret isn't what they're doing, but what they're not doing? And what if that one practice, that single act of restraint, could transform everything about your life, your energy, your power, your success? By the end of this video, you'll understand what Gurdjieff discovered about male sexual energy that most men never learn. You'll know why conserving this energy doesn't just change how you feel, but how the world responds to you. And you'll see why the men who practice this restraint consistently win in ways that seem almost supernatural to everyone else. But before we reveal exactly how this works, we need to understand something most people never consider: what actually happens when you release. And to understand that, we first need to look at what Gurdjieff called the most precious substance in the human body. Gurdjieff wasn't a moralist. He wasn't preaching religious doctrine or outdated values. He was a pragmatist who studied human consciousness for decades across multiple continents. And what he discovered about sexual energy shocked even his most dedicated students. He taught that man is essentially a machine. Most people live their entire lives as unconscious automations, responding mechanically to stimuli, repeating patterns without awareness, driven by impulses they mistake for choices. And among all these mechanical impulses, none binds more tightly than the sexual drive. You think you're free when you release. You think orgasm is liberation, pleasure, a natural right. But Gurdjieff saw it differently. He saw it as the moment when your most precious resource drains away, when the very substance needed for consciousness itself is wasted, when the possibility of awakening is traded for seconds of blind sensation. He called this substance higher hydrogens, or subtle matter, the raw material that could be transformed into awareness, presence, magnetism, real power. Every other system in your body produces energy that can be used for higher purposes. But sexual energy is unique. It's the most refined, the most potent, the most valuable. And most men spill it thoughtlessly, day after day, never realizing what they're losing. Think about how you feel after orgasm: the immediate deflation, the slight emptiness, the diminished motivation, the foggy thinking. You've been told this is normal, just biology. But what if it's actually evidence of something being taken from you? Something you can't afford to lose? Gurdjieff observed that men who couldn't master this energy remained forever stuck in mechanical existence. They would never develop real will, never cultivate genuine presence, never access the higher states of consciousness available to human beings, because they were bleeding away the fuel required for transformation. He wasn't advocating for complete lifelong celibacy for everyone. He was pointing to a principle. That sexual energy, when conserved and transmuted, becomes something far more valuable than momentary pleasure. It becomes the foundation for building what he called the second body, the conscious self that most people never develop. And here's what most men miss. The world rewards this conservation in tangible ways. Not through mystical magic, but through actual shifts in biology, psychology, and social dynamics. Men who practice restraint don't just feel different, they become different. And everyone around them responds to that difference, often without knowing why. You've probably noticed this yourself without understanding it. The man who seems unshakable, the one who's never desperate for female attention, the guy who radiates a kind of calm intensity that others can't match. Chances are, whether he knows it consciously or not, he's conserving energy that other men waste. Gurdjieff called these rare individuals candidates for evolution, not because they're morally superior, but because they've stopped the leak. They've patched the hole that keeps most men perpetually depleted. And in doing so, they've accessed a reservoir of power that changes everything. But how exactly does this work? What happens in your body and mind when you stop releasing? What are the actual mechanisms that create this transformation? To understand that, we need to look at what Gurdjieff discovered about the relationship between sexual energy and consciousness. And that's where the real revelation begins. Every time you orgasm, something leaves your body. You feel it immediately. The sudden drop in energy, the loss of motivation, the slight depression that creeps in afterward. Most men have been conditioned to ignore this, to pretend it doesn't happen, or to believe it's just a temporary biological response. But Gurdjieff understood it differently. He taught that sexual energy is not just any energy. It's the most refined substance your body produces, the end product of a complex process where food, air, and impressions are transformed through multiple stages into increasingly subtle forms. And sexual energy sits at the top of this hierarchy. When you conserve this energy instead of releasing it, your body doesn't just stop producing it, it begins to accumulate. And this accumulation creates effects that are both immediate and profound. But before we explore those effects, you need to understand why this energy is so critical in the first place. Gurdjieff observed that ordinary consciousness requires fuel. Just like your muscles need glucose and your brain needs oxygen, your awareness needs a specific kind of energy to function at higher levels. Without this fuel, you remain in what he called waking sleep. You're technically conscious, but barely. You drift through life reacting to circumstances, unable to self-remember, incapable of sustained attention. Sexual energy, when conserved, provides exactly this fuel. It's a substance that can be transformed into heightened awareness, genuine presence, sustained attention. This isn't metaphysical speculation. It's observable. Men who practice retention report the same effects across cultures and centuries. Sharper thinking, deeper focus, expanded awareness, stronger willpower. Your body knows this substance is valuable. That's why it takes so much biological effort to produce it. That's why the urge to release is so powerful. Nature wants you to reproduce. But Gurdjieff pointed out that you have a choice. You can serve nature's agenda, spreading genetics without consciousness. Or you can redirect this energy toward your own evolution. When you stop releasing, the first thing you notice is physical. Energy returns to your system. Not nervous energy or anxious restlessness, but a deep, vital force. You wake up with more drive. You move through the day with more stamina. Your eyes brighten. Your voice deepens. Your presence intensifies. Others notice before you do. But the physical changes are just the beginning. The real transformation happens psychologically. The constant distraction of sexual craving begins to quiet. The obsessive thoughts about women, about release, about the next pleasure, they start to fade. And in that space, something else emerges. Clarity. You begin to think more precisely. Problems that seemed complex become simpler. Decisions that paralyzed you become obvious. Your mind, no longer clouded by perpetual sexual static, operates at a higher frequency. This is what Gurdjieff meant when he said that most men think with their sex centers instead of their intellectual centers. Conserve the energy, and you reclaim your mind. The emotional shifts are equally dramatic. The mood swings that used to control you, the depression after release, the anxiety when craving builds, they stabilize. You feel more grounded, more centered, less reactive to external circumstances. It's as if you've discovered an internal anchor that holds you steady regardless of what storms blow around you. But here's what Gurdjieff emphasized that most people miss. This isn't just about feeling better. It's about becoming capable of things that were previously impossible. Sustained attention, self-remembering, conscious action rather than mechanical reaction. These higher functions require energy that most men simply don't have because they're constantly depleting themselves. And there's another effect that's less discussed but equally important. When you conserve sexual energy, your relationship with desire itself changes. You're no longer enslaved by craving. You can feel attraction without being controlled by it. You can notice beauty without becoming obsessed with possessing it. This freedom from compulsion is intoxicating in a way that release never was. Women sense this immediately. The desperate hunger that radiates from most men, the needy energy, the obvious craving, it repels them at an instinctual level. But a man who's conserved his energy radiates something different: self-containment, independence, a kind of fullness rather than emptiness seeking to be filled. And this magnetizes attraction in ways that pursuit never could. But the question remains, if conservation creates all these benefits, why don't more men practice it? Why does the entire culture push men toward constant release? To understand that, we need to look at what Gurdjieff called the forces that feed on humanity. And that's where things get truly eye-opening. Gurdjieff taught something that sounds paranoid until you examine it closely: that there are forces, both conscious and mechanical, that benefit from keeping humanity asleep. And one of the most effective ways to ensure men remain unconscious is to keep them perpetually depleted of the very energy they need to wake up. Look around. What do you see? An entire culture built on sexual stimulation. Advertisements using sexuality to sell everything. Entertainment industries profiting from pornography. Dating apps designed to keep you swiping, chasing, pursuing endless novelty. Music, movies, social media, all of it engineered to keep your sexual energy activated and flowing outward. This isn't accidental. It's systematic. Because a man who's constantly releasing is a man who's easily controlled. He's distracted, depleted, dependent on external stimulation for temporary relief. He spends his money chasing the next thrill. He wastes his time scrolling for images that drain him. He loses his mornings waking up hollow and his nights pursuing what will leave him empty again. Gurdjieff would say this man is not dangerous to the system. He's docile, manageable, predictable. He can be sold products, manipulated through promises of sexual access, kept working to fund his addictions. He poses no threat because he has no energy for anything beyond survival and immediate gratification. But the man who conserves, he's different. He can't be controlled through sexual manipulation because he's not desperate. He can't be distracted through pornography because he's seen through that trap. He can't be bought with promises of pleasure because he's discovered something more valuable: his own power. This is why Gurdjieff insisted that sexual discipline was one of the foundations of what he called the work. Not because sex itself is evil or wrong, but because the mechanical waste of sexual energy keeps men imprisoned in the lowest levels of consciousness. And forces that profit from sleeping humanity have every incentive to keep this prison functioning. Think about the messaging you've received your entire life. That sexual release is healthy, that retention is dangerous or repressive, that use it or lose it applies to sexual function, that frequent orgasms prevent prostate cancer or reduce stress. All of these claims designed to keep you depleted, justified by selective science and cultural conditioning. But examine the men who achieved greatness throughout history: warriors who abstained before battle, monks who channeled celibacy into spiritual insight, artists who experienced long periods of retention during their most creative phases, athletes who conserved their energy before competition. They weren't ignorant of sexuality. They understood something modern men have forgotten: that sexual energy is too valuable to waste, that the same force driving you toward reproduction can be redirected toward creation, toward consciousness, toward real power. But this redirection requires what Gurdjieff called conscious suffering, the deliberate choice to resist mechanical impulses, to say no to what your body demands, to endure the discomfort of accumulated energy until you learn to transmute it into something higher. Most men will never do this. The suffering feels too great. The culture offers too many easy releases, and the benefits of conservation are invisible at first, requiring weeks or months of practice before they become undeniable. So they remain trapped in the cycle: release, depletion, craving, release, over and over until they die. never having accessed the reservoir of power available to them. But for the man who persists, who resists despite every temptation, something remarkable happens. He begins to feel like he's operating on a different frequency than everyone else. Conversations that used to absorb him become trivial. Temptations that used to control him lose their power. Drama that used to destabilize him barely registers. He's building what Gurdjieff called a permanent center of gravity, an internal foundation that external circumstances can't shake. And this foundation is built brick by brick through each act of conscious restraint. Each time he refuses the mechanical impulse, he's strengthening his will. And will is the one thing that separates conscious beings from machines. Gurdjieff warned that the path is difficult, that most who start will give up, that the forces keeping humanity asleep will push back against anyone who tries to wake. But he also promised that those who persist discover something worth more than all the pleasure they've sacrificed. They discover what it means to be truly alive. And that's what we need to explore next. When a man commits to sexual conservation, the changes don't happen all at once. They accumulate gradually, compounding over time until the man barely recognizes who he was before. Gurdjieff described this as the crystallization of the higher being, the slow formation of something permanent within the temporary vehicle of the body. The first month is the hardest. Your body rebels. You've trained it to expect release, and now you're denying it. Urges intensify. Dreams become vivid and sexual. Every woman you see seems more attractive than before. This is the mechanical part of you fighting to maintain control, to keep you in the cycle. Most men break here. They rationalize. They convince themselves that occasional release won't hurt, and they return to the pattern. But the man who endures this phase discovers something on the other side. The urges don't disappear, but they transform. What was once desperate craving becomes available energy. The same force that drove you toward orgasm is now available for other purposes: work, creation, building, training. The restlessness doesn't go away, it gets channeled. Gurdjieff called this the proper use of sex energy. Instead of letting it discharge mechanically, you direct it consciously. Some men channel it into physical training and develop bodies that seem to defy their age. Others pour it into creative work and produce at levels they never imagined possible. Still others use it to develop presence and become the kind of men that others instinctively follow. The social effects are undeniable. Women respond differently. They sense something has changed, though they can't articulate what. The desperate energy that used to repel them is gone. In its place is a kind of self-contained power. You're not pursuing. You're not proving anything. You're simply present, and that presence is magnetic in ways that effort never was. Men respond differently too. There's a subtle shift in hierarchy. The ones who used to challenge you become deferential. The ones who ignored you start paying attention. It's not that you're trying to dominate. It's that accumulated energy creates a natural authority that others recognize instinctively. Gurdjieff would say, you're carrying more being, and being commands respect without demanding it. Your work improves dramatically. Tasks that used to require enormous effort become easier. Concentration that was impossible to maintain now comes naturally. You enter flow states more frequently and stay in them longer. Your productivity multiplies not because you're working harder, but because you're working from a deeper reservoir of energy. But the most profound changes are internal. You develop what Gurdjieff called self-remembering, the ability to observe yourself while acting, to be aware of your own consciousness while engaged in the world. Most people live their entire lives completely identified with their thoughts and emotions. They are their anger, their desire, their fear. But the man who conserves energy begins to develop an observer, a witness that remains separate. This observer changes everything. You still feel emotions, but you're not controlled by them. You still experience desire, but you're not enslaved by it. You still face challenges, but you're not overwhelmed by them. There's a part of you that remains stable, watching, conscious, regardless of external circumstances. Gurdjieff taught that this is the beginning of real individuality, that most people are just bundles of conditioned responses and mechanical reactions. They think they have a self, but it's just a collection of programs running unconsciously. The conserved man begins to develop an actual self, something permanent that persists beneath the changing surface of thoughts and feelings. And with this self comes genuine freedom, not the false freedom of doing whatever you want, but the real freedom of not being controlled by what you want. The man who can resist his deepest biological impulse discovers he can resist anything. Every weakness, every temptation, every distraction that derails other men. He can say no to all of it. This is why Gurdjieff insisted that work with sexual energy was essential for anyone serious about awakening. It's the most accessible and the most powerful practice available. Because if you can master this, you can master anything. And mastery is what separates machines from men. But there's still one question we haven't answered, the most important one. How do you actually do this? What's the practical path forward? That's what we need to address in the final part. So how do you actually walk this path? How do you go from mechanical release to conscious conservation? Gurdjieff would tell you there's no magic formula, no easy technique that bypasses the work. But there is a framework, a map that makes the journey possible. The first principle is decision, not a vague intention or a hopeful wish, but a conscious decision made with full awareness of what you're committing to. This isn't about trying to quit. It's about choosing to conserve. The difference matters. One is passive avoidance. The other is active direction of energy. Make the decision clearly. Speak it aloud if necessary. Write it down. But whatever you do, make it conscious. Gurdjieff taught that unconscious decisions have no power. They collapse at the first temptation. But a decision made with full awareness creates a structure in consciousness that can withstand pressure. The second principle is observation without judgment. You will fail, probably multiple times. The mechanical patterns are deeply ingrained. Your body will rebel. Your mind will rationalize. Circumstances will conspire to break your resolve. When this happens, don't collapse into shame or self-punishment. Observe it. Study how the breakdown occurred. What triggered it? What story did you tell yourself to justify it? What weakness did it expose? Every failure contains information. Gurdjieff called these moments shocks that can either wake you up further or put you back to sleep. If you respond with awareness, with genuine observation of the mechanical process that led to release, the failure becomes valuable. You learn where your weak points are. You identify the patterns that need addressing. The third principle is redirection. Conserved energy doesn't just sit peacefully, it wants expression. If you simply try to repress it, you'll create internal pressure that eventually explodes. But if you redirect it into purposeful activity, it transforms into power. This is why Gurdjieff emphasized that work on sexual energy must accompany work on a definite aim. What are you building? What mission drives you? What creation demands your energy? Pour the accumulated force into that. Use the restlessness to fuel training. Channel the intensity into focused work. Transform the sexual drive into creative drive. This isn't sublimation in the Freudian sense. It's conscious transmutation. You're taking energy from one center and deliberately moving it to another. The fourth principle is elimination. Your environment either supports this practice or sabotages it. Gurdjieff was ruthless about this. If something in your life triggers mechanical release, remove it. Unfollow the accounts that display women's bodies. Delete the apps that facilitate casual sex. Avoid the media that sexually stimulates. Cut out the friends who mock your discipline and drag you back into indulgence. This sounds extreme, but it's necessary. You're fighting against powerful mechanical habits and a culture designed to keep you enslaved. You need every advantage. Your environment must support your aim, not undermine it. Most men fail because they try to maintain conservation while swimming in a sea of sexual triggers. It doesn't work. The fifth principle is community. Find other men walking this path, not to compare or compete, but to support and remind. Gurdjieff established groups for exactly this reason. Conscious work is nearly impossible in isolation. You need others who understand what you're attempting, who can call out your rationalizations, who can remind you why this matters when your resolve weakens. These men exist. They're rare, but they're out there. Online communities, local groups, friends who are serious about mastery, seek them out. Be selective. Many groups claiming to support retention are just filled with men who are struggling without progress. Find the ones who've actually succeeded, who embody the changes you're pursuing. Finally, remember why you're doing this. Not to prove something, not to achieve moral superiority. Not because pleasure is evil, but because you've glimpsed the possibility of something greater. A life lived consciously instead of mechanically. A self that's real instead of borrowed. Power that comes from within instead of dependent on external circumstances. Gurdjieff promised that the man who conserves his sexual energy and uses it consciously will develop capacities that sleeping men can't imagine. Enhanced awareness, unshakable will, magnetic presence, the ability to create, to lead, to influence, to command respect without demanding it. But more than any external reward, he'll gain something priceless. Himself, not the collection of programs and conditioned responses, but an actual self, permanent, conscious, real. The choice is before you. Continue leaking away your power or patch the hole and begin building something that lasts. The world needs conscious men. Men who've done the work. Men who've mastered themselves. If this resonates, write in the comments, I choose consciousness. The path is difficult, but everything worth having is, and what you'll gain makes every sacrifice worth it. Welcome to the work.